The Tlingit people who used to live in these woods had a name for the things that watch you from between the trees. Kushtaka, they called them. Shapeshifters that could look like anyone you've ever loved, calling your name and voices you recognize until you follow them deep enough into the wilderness that you never find your way home. I used to think that was just old folklore, the kind of stories people tell to keep outsiders away from sacred places. But 3 months into living here, I've learned that the forest has its own heartbeat, and sometimes that heartbeat skips. Sometimes I hear my dead father calling my name from the woods behind the cabin, using the same whistle he taught me when I was 7 years old. Sometimes I see my sister's face peering at me from between the birch trees, even though she lives 3,000 miles away in Florida. The smart part of my brain knows it's not really them, but the lonely part, the part that's been isolated in these woods for too long, keeps wanting to open the door and follow those familiar voices into the dark. My name is Jacob, and 6 months ago I was teaching environmental science at a community college in Spokane. Had a decent apartment, a girlfriend named Monica, who made excellent tamales, and a Toyota Corolla that only broke down twice a year. Life was ordinary in the best possible way, until my grandfather died and left me this cabin. Grandpa Henrik had been a stubborn Norwegian who came to Alaska in the 50s to work the fishing boats out of Ketchikan. After he retired, he bought this place, 40 acres of pristine wilderness about 20 miles southeast of Haines, accessible only by a logging road that turns into little more than deer tracks after the first 10 miles. The nearest neighbor is a Tlingit elder named Mrs. Kayahat, who lives 7 miles downriver, and she only comes around when the salmon run thick or when something's wrong. I inherited the cabin because nobody else in the family wanted it. My cousins called it a money pit, in the middle of nowhere. Mom said it was too remote, too lonely, too much work for someone who'd never lived off-grid. But I'd been having panic attacks in Spokane. Something about too many people, too much noise, the constant pressure of modern life grinding me down to nothing. The cabin seemed like salvation. The drive up here took 3 days. I loaded everything I owned into a U-Haul trailer and followed the Alaska Highway through British Columbia, watching the landscape shift from rolling hills to genuine wilderness. By the time I reached the turnoff near Haines, my hands were cramping from gripping the wheel so tight. The logging road hadn't been maintained in years, and I nearly lost the trailer, twice crossing makeshift bridges over creeks swollen with snowmelt. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos Grandpa had sent me years ago. A sturdy log structure with a green metal roof, solar panels Grandpa had installed himself, and a generator shed that housed a diesel Kubota he'd bought from a fishing boat captain in Juneau. The inside smelled like wood smoke and machine oil, with bookshelves full of Norwegian novels and field guides to Alaskan wildlife. It took me a week to get the basics running: water pump, propane lines, and the satellite internet that barely worked when the weather cooperated. That's when Mrs. Kayahat showed up for the first time, carrying a mason jar of salmon jerky, and wearing an expression that suggested she had important things to tell me about living in her ancestors' woods. Mrs. Kayahat knocked on my door at exactly sunset on my 8th day here, though I hadn't heard her approach. One moment I was washing dishes in the kitchen sink, looking out at the birch grove behind the cabin, and the next moment she was standing on my porch like she'd materialized from the forest itself. She was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 5'2", with silver hair braided down her back and wearing a well-worn Carhartt jacket that had seen decades of Alaskan weather. Her eyes were the color of river stones, and when she looked at me, I got the distinct feeling she was seeing more than just a city boy who'd inherited his grandfather's cabin. "You're Henrik's grandson," she said. Not a question. "He told me you might come someday." I invited her inside, made coffee on the propane stove, and we sat at Grandpa's kitchen table while she examined me with the patience of someone who'd outlived most of her contemporaries. She ate the salmon jerky slowly, each bite deliberate, and I noticed she kept glancing toward the windows that faced the forest. "Your grandfather was a good neighbor," she said finally. "Respectful. He understood that some places require cooperation." "Cooperation? The land here is old, Jacob. Older than the Russians who came for fur. Older than the gold miners who tore up the creeks. My grandmother's grandmother told stories about this valley, about the things that live in the spaces between what white people call real and not real." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and refolded many times. The ink was faded, but still legible, written in Grandpa's careful handwriting. "Henrik wrote these down after his first winter here. Smart man. He asked the right questions instead of assuming he knew better than people who'd lived here for thousands of years." I unfolded the paper. 7 rules, numbered in Grandpa's familiar script. 1. Never answer voices calling from the woods after dark, even if you recognize them. Especially if you recognize them. 2. Keep iron nails driven into every door frame and window. Replace them monthly. 3. If you see someone standing perfectly still in the tree line, do not acknowledge them. Close the curtains and wait. 4. Between midnight and 4 a.m., do not look outside. Cover mirrors during these hours. 5. If something knocks on your door 3 times, do not answer. If it knocks more or fewer times, answer immediately. 6. Never follow animal tracks that lead in perfectly straight lines. 7. On nights when the aurora is green, burn sage and stay inside until dawn. I read through the list twice, my coffee growing cold in my hands. Mrs. Kahat, these rules. They're not exactly what I'd call normal neighborly advice. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. Normal is a luxury for people who live in places where the old agreements still hold. Out here, the boundaries are thinner. The kushtaka I told you about when you first arrived, they're just one thing that walks between worlds. You're talking about shapeshifters. I'm talking about survival. She stood up, adjusting her jacket. Your grandfather survived 30 winters here because he listened. He didn't need to believe in every story, but he respected the wisdom behind them. Through the kitchen window, I could see the first stars appearing between the branches. Mrs. Kayahat noticed my glance and nodded approvingly. Good. You're already learning to pay attention to when day becomes night. That's the first step. She moved toward the door, then paused. Henrik left you more than just a cabin, Jakob. He left you a responsibility. This land has been watched over for generations. Now it's your turn. After she left, I walked through the cabin, checking every door frame and window. Sure enough, iron nails were driven deep into the wood, their heads worn smooth by decades of Alaskan weather. In the bedroom, I found a mirror covered with a heavy cloth, and when I lifted the edge to peek underneath, my reflection looked somehow wrong. Too pale, too distant, like I was looking at someone who resembled me but wasn't quite right. I let the cloth fall back into place and checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until the first rule would matter most. I spent those 13 minutes covering every mirror in the cabin with whatever I could find. Towels, bed sheets, even a pizza box I'd flattened from my first week here. The bathroom mirror was the worst. When I draped a beach towel over it, Something in the reflection seemed to move just before the glass disappeared behind the fabric. At exactly midnight, the first voice called my name. Jakob. Clear as daylight, coming from somewhere in the birch grove behind the cabin. My father's voice, using the same tone he'd used when I was 12 and staying out past curfew. Patient but firm, with just enough disappointment to make me feel guilty. My hand was already reaching for the back door handle before I caught myself. The rule sheet crinkled in my other fist, where I'd been gripping it. Never answer voices calling from the woods after dark, even if you recognize them. Especially if you recognize them. Jakob, come on out here. I want to show you something. Dad had been dead for 6 years. Lung cancer, 2 packs a day since he was 16. I'd held his hand while he died in a hospital bed in Spokane, listening to machines beep and watching his chest rise and fall in mechanical rhythm. There was no way he was standing in the forest behind Grandpa's cabin, calling my name like we were going fishing at dawn. But it sounded exactly like him, down to the way he pronounced my name with just a hint of his Minnesota accent, the one that came out strongest when he was tired or trying to convince me to do something I didn't want to do. I moved away from the door and sat down hard in Grandpa's recliner, clutching the rule sheet like a talisman. The voice called again, closer now, maybe 50 yards from the back porch. Jakob, don't be stubborn. You know I don't have all night. That was pure Dad. He'd said those exact words to me probably 1,000 times. When I wouldn't get ready for school, when I dawdled over chores, when I spent too long deciding what to order at restaurants. The familiarity of it made my chest ache with longing. I forced myself to stay in the chair and check my watch. 12:17 a.m. Still 3 hours and 43 minutes until I could look outside again. The knocking started at 12:33. 3 sharp raps on the front door, spaced evenly apart. I consulted the rules. If something knocks on your door 3 times, do not answer. I waited, counting seconds in my head. At 30 seconds, the knocking came again. 3 raps, identical to the first set. Then silence. My father's voice had stopped calling, but now I could hear something else. Footsteps circling the cabin, slow and steady, like someone conducting a thorough inspection. They moved from the back door around the east side, pausing at each window. At the living room window, the footsteps stopped completely. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear what was happening outside that window. The curtains were drawn tight, but I could sense something standing just beyond the glass, waiting, watching. Then the footsteps resumed, completing their circuit around the cabin. When they reached the front door again, I expected more knocking. Instead, I heard something that made my skin crawl. The sound of someone trying the door handle, testing it gently, seeing if it was locked. It was. I checked it twice after Mrs. Kayahat left. The handle stopped moving, and the footsteps retreated from the porch. But they didn't go away. Instead, they began another slow circle around the cabin, like a wolf pacing the perimeter of a camp. I stayed in the recliner until 2:18 a.m., when the footsteps finally faded into the forest. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the pacing. It felt expectant, like the darkness outside was holding its breath and waiting for me to make a mistake. At 3:45 a.m., Monica's voice joined the chorus. "Jacob, baby, why won't you answer me?" She sounded confused, hurt. "I drove all the way up here to surprise you. I'm lost in these woods, and I'm scared." Monica, who was afraid of camping and had never driven farther north than Seattle. Monica, who I hadn't talked to since the breakup 3 months ago, when she told me I was running away from my problems instead of facing them. Please jack up. There's something following me. I can hear it in the trees. Her voice was moving, circling the cabin just like the footsteps had. Sometimes she sounded close enough to touch the windows, sometimes farther away, as if she were wandering through the birch grove. But always moving, never staying in one place long enough for me to get a fix on where she might actually be. I can see lights in your cabin. I know you're in there. Why won't you help me? Because you're not really Monica, I thought. Because Monica doesn't know I inherited this place. Because Monica is 3,000 miles away, probably asleep in her apartment in Spokane, curled up next to the new boyfriend she started dating 2 weeks after we broke up. But her voice sounded so scared, so genuinely lost. Part of me, the part that had loved her for 2 years, wanted to throw open the door and run into the darkness to find her, to be her hero one last time. I gripped the rule sheet tighter and watched the numbers on my digital clock crawl toward 4 a.m. 37 minutes. I could last 37 minutes. At 3:58, all the voices started calling at once. Dad from the backyard, patient and disappointed. Monica from the side of the cabin, scared and pleading. And now a third voice I hadn't heard before. My sister Emma, calling from somewhere near the front porch. Jacob, oh my God, you have to see this. Come out here right now. Emma, who lived in Tampa and hadn't spoken to me since Christmas. Emma, who thought I was crazy for moving to Alaska. Emma, whose voice was tight with excitement and terror. There's something amazing out here. Something you won't believe, but you have to come now, before it's gone. 4 a.m. arrived like salvation. The voices stopped mid-sentence, cutting off so abruptly that the silence rang in my ears. I waited 5 more minutes, then crept to the living room window and peeled back the edge of the curtain. The forest looked normal. Birch trees swaying gently in the night breeze, their white bark ghostly in the starlight. No figures standing between the trunks. No signs that anything had been circling my cabin for the past 4 hours. But in the dirt near my front porch, I could see footprints. 3 sets, forming overlapping circles around the cabin like some kind of ritualistic dance. The tracks were too far away to make out details, but they were definitely there. Proof that something had been pacing my perimeter all night. Something that knew the voices of people I'd loved. Hi everyone. Before we move forward, I have something exciting to tell you. Many of you asked for stories without the strange rules, so I created a brand new channel just for that. It's called Mr. Grimm Archive. The link is in the description, or you can click the card above. I think you'll really enjoy it. So check it out whenever you want some more exciting types of stories. Also, I hope you're enjoying the 2 uploads a day. Let me know in the comments if you like some stories from your location. Now, let's continue with today's story. Dawn came slowly, painting the birch grove in shades of gold and amber. I dozed fitfully in Grandpa's recliner, jerking awake every hour to check the time and listen for sounds outside. When the first real sunlight hit the windows, I felt like a prisoner whose sentence had been commuted. I made coffee and scrambled eggs, normal morning activities that helped convince me the previous night had actually happened. But when I stepped onto the front porch, the footprints were still there, pressed deep into the soft earth around my cabin. 3 sets of tracks, just like I'd glimpsed through the curtain. But in full daylight, the details made my stomach clench. The first set looked like work boots, size 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel, exactly like the red wings my father had worn to every construction job for 20 years. The second set were smaller, women's hiking boots with a zigzag tread pattern I remembered from camping trips with Monica. The third set made me sit down hard on the porch steps. Emma's sneakers. The same Converse high tops she'd been wearing in every photo she'd posted on Instagram for the past 5 years, down to the star-shaped logo pressed into the dirt. I followed the tracks around the cabin, documenting their circuit with my phone camera. They formed 3 perfect circles, overlapping but never crossing, like some kind of elaborate choreography. At several points, the tracks paused, always directly beneath windows, always facing the glass, as if whoever had made them was trying to peer inside. What bothered me most wasn't the accuracy of the footprints. It was how they ended. All 3 sets simply stopped at the edge of the birch grove, as if their makers had walked to that exact line and then vanished into thin air. No drag marks, no signs of struggle, no indication they'd climbed trees or doubled back. They just ended. I was photographing the final prints when Mrs. Caudahat's voice made me jump. They're getting bolder. She stood at the edge of my driveway, wearing the same Carhartt jacket and carrying a woven basket that smelled like smoked salmon. I hadn't heard her approach, which seemed to be a talent of hers. "You mean the things that made these tracks?" "Kushtaka," she said, walking over to examine the footprints. "Shapeshifters. They've been testing you, learning your weaknesses. The voices they used, all people you've lost or left behind. How could they know about Monica? About my sister?" Mrs. Caudahat knelt beside the boot prints, running her fingers just above the impressions without touching them. "They read you like a book written in a language they've spoken for centuries. Loneliness, regret, love, guilt. These emotions echo in the forest. The Kushtaka collect them, use them to craft better traps." She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Your grandfather went through this too, his first winter. They used his wife's voice for months after she died, trying to lure him into the woods. Grandma died when I was little. Cancer. That's right. Henrik told me how the Kushtaka would call to him in her voice, begging him to come find her, telling him she was lost and scared and needed him. He almost answered once, during a blizzard in February. Said he had his hand on the door handle before he remembered the rules. The thought of Grandpa standing in this same cabin, listening to Grandma's voice calling from the frozen forest, made my chest ache. How many nights had he spent in that recliner, white-knuckling his way through till dawn? Why do they want us to come outside? What happens if someone answers? Mrs. Caudahat's expression darkened. Nobody who's answered has ever come back to tell us. But the stories say the Kushtaka take you deep into the forest, to places where the trees grow in patterns that make no sense, where the ground slopes upward, but water still flows downhill. They keep you there, feeding off your confusion and fear, until you forget who you used to be. She handed me the basket. Inside were strips of dried salmon, mason jars of preserved berries, and something wrapped in sealskin that felt heavy and metallic. Salt, she explained, noting my questioning look. Mixed with iron filings and blessed sage. Sprinkle it around your property line once a week. The Kushtaka don't like crossing it. What about during the day? Are they only active at night? Mostly. But they're adapting, learning your schedule. Some of the older ones can maintain their disguises even in sunlight, though it takes more effort. She glanced toward the forest, where the birch trees swayed in the morning breeze. There's something else, Jakob. Something Henrik never had to deal with. What do you mean? Climate change is affecting everything up here, including the old boundaries. The permafrost is melting, releasing things that have been frozen for thousands of years. And the Kushtaka are getting stronger, more persistent. They used to respect certain limits, but those agreements are breaking down. As if summoned by her words, I heard something, A whistle, clear and sharp, coming from the birch grove. The same 3-note pattern my father had taught me as a kid. Our secret signal when we went hunting together. Mrs. Kayahat grabbed my arm as I took an involuntary step toward the sound. "No," she said firmly. "Remember the rules. It's still daylight, but that doesn't mean you're safe." The whistle came again, more insistent this time. Through the trees, I could see a figure standing about 50 yards into the forest. Tall, wearing a red flannel shirt, just like the one Dad had been buried in. Even from this distance, the stance was perfect. Hands in pockets, weight shifted onto his left foot, head tilted slightly to the right, like he was listening for something. "Don't acknowledge it," Mrs. Kayahat whispered. "Close your eyes if you have to." But I couldn't look away. The figure raised one hand in a familiar wave, the same gesture Dad had used to greet me every morning when he drove me to school. Then it cupped both hands around its mouth and called my name in Dad's voice, clear as a bell across the morning air. "Jakob. Come on, son. We need to talk." Mrs. Kayahat pulled me backward, away from the forest edge. "Inside. Now." I let her guide me to the cabin, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The figure was moving now, walking parallel to the tree line, but never stepping out of the shadows, following our retreat with patient, measured steps. We reached the porch just as the figure stopped walking. It stood perfectly still for a long moment, then raised both hands to its mouth and whistled again. 3 sharp notes that echoed off the mountains and seemed to hang in the air long after they should have faded. "It's not giving up," I said. Mrs. Kayahat closed the cabin door firmly behind us and turned the deadbolt. "No," she agreed. "They never do. But your grandfather survived 30 winters here, Jakob. The rules work, if you follow them exactly. The challenge is learning to live with what's outside your door." Through the living room window, I could still see the figure in the red flannel shirt. It had moved closer, maybe 30 yards from the cabin now, standing at the very edge of where the forest met my cleared yard. Close enough that I could make out individual features. The gray beard Dad had grown the last year of his life. The wire-rimmed glasses he'd worn since I was a teenager. Even the small scar on his forehead from a childhood accident with a slingshot. It looked exactly like him. Every detail perfect, down to the way he stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops. But something about the stillness was wrong. Dad had never been able to stand motionless for more than a few seconds. He was always shifting his weight, adjusting his glasses, drumming his fingers against his leg. This thing had been standing statue still for 5 full minutes, watching my cabin with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The figure in the red flannel shirt stood at the forest edge for 6 hours. Mrs. Kayahat stayed with me until noon, brewing tea on my propane stove and sharing stories about her grandmother's encounters with the kushtaka during the harsh winter of 1962. But even her presence couldn't make me stop glancing toward the window every few minutes, checking to see if the thing pretending to be my father had moved. It hadn't. Same position, same posture, same patient stillness that no living person could maintain. "It's waiting for you to acknowledge it," Mrs. Kayahat explained as she prepared to leave. "Once you look directly at it, make eye contact, it gains power." The old stories say eye contact creates a connection, like opening the door between worlds. What if I ignore it completely? Eventually it will give up and try something else. But Jakob... She paused at my front door, her weathered hand on the knob. "The rules protect you, but they're not a cure. Living here means accepting that you'll never be completely alone. There's always something watching from the trees, waiting for you to make a mistake." After she left, I tried to go about my normal routine. I checked the solar battery levels, organized my books, attempted to read a chapter of the Alaska Field Guide Grandpa had left on his coffee table. But every few pages I'd catch myself looking toward the window. The figure was still there, motionless as carved stone. By late afternoon, my nerves were frayed. I'd been trapped inside my own cabin for hours because something wearing my dead father's face was standing in my yard. The isolation I'd craved in Spokane suddenly felt like a prison sentence. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I pressed my face to the kitchen window and looked carefully, there was no mistaking what I saw in the dirt between the cabin and the forest edge: animal tracks. Perfectly straight lines leading from the birch grove toward my back door. Rule number 6. Never follow animal tracks that lead in perfectly straight lines. The tracks looked like wolf prints, but larger than any wolf I'd seen in field guides. They formed 3 parallel lines, each one arrow straight, converging on the back corner of my cabin like the spokes of a wheel. No meandering, no natural curve or deviation that real animals would make while hunting or exploring. I grabbed my binoculars from the kitchen drawer and focused on the tree line. Between the white birch trunks, I could make out shapes moving in the shadows. Not the random motion of forest animals, but coordinated movement, like a pack working together. 3 wolves emerged from the forest, walking single file toward the cabin. Their fur was mottled gray and black, and they moved with synchronized steps that looked choreographed. No animal walked like that. No pack hunted in formation that precise. But what made my hands shake was their eyes. Even from 100 yards away, I could see they weren't wolf eyes. They were human eyes, blue and intelligent, and filled with the same patient hunger I'd seen in the figure wearing Dad's face. The wolves reached the point where their tracks stopped, maybe 20 feet from my back porch. They sat down in perfect unison, 3 statue-still sentinels arranged in a semicircle, watching the cabin, waiting. I had watchers at my front door and my back door now. The thing pretending to be Dad at the forest edge, and 3 not wolves guarding my rear exit. They weren't trying to get inside. They were making sure I couldn't get out. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Soon it would be dark, and the voices would start calling again. But this time, I'd be surrounded. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual this far from town. The satellite internet had been spotty all day, probably due to the cloud cover rolling in from the coast. I was truly alone, cut off from the outside world, with no way to call for help, even if help existed. At 7:30 p.m., the Dad figure finally moved. It took 3 steps forward, crossing from the forest edge into my cleared yard. Then it stopped again, maybe 25 yards from my front porch, close enough that I could see the details of its face clearly through the window. The resemblance was perfect. Every wrinkle, every gray hair in the beard, every familiar expression I had seen 1,000 times during childhood. But there was something wrong with the way it breathed. Too regular, too controlled, like someone consciously remembering to inhale and exhale. It raised one hand and waved at me, a slow, deliberate gesture that seemed designed to catch my attention. Don't look directly at it, I reminded myself. Don't make eye contact. But the movement was so familiar, so achingly reminiscent of real memories, that I found my gaze drawn to its face despite my better judgment. For just a moment, our eyes met through the living room window. The thing smiled. Not Dad's smile, something else wearing Dad's mouth, pulling the lips back in an expression that looked like happiness, but felt like threat. The teeth were wrong, too white, too perfect, arranged in rows that seemed to go back farther than they should. The moment I looked away, breaking that brief eye contact, the thing began walking toward the cabin. Not the shuffling gait of an old man, but smooth strides that covered ground faster than they should have. It reached my front porch in seconds, climbing the steps with footfalls that sounded exactly like Dad's work boots on wood. Then it knocked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 knocks. Rapid fire, like machine gun bursts. More than 3, which according to Rule 5 meant I should answer immediately. My hand was reaching for the door handle before I caught myself. The rule said to answer if something knocked more or fewer times than 3. But what if the rules were wrong? What if this was exactly the kind of trap Mrs. Cayahat had warned me about? The knocking came again. 8 precise raps, spaced evenly apart. Behind the cabin, I could hear the knot wolves moving around, their paws scratching against the back porch steps. They weren't trying to get inside either, just positioning themselves, creating a barrier between me and any possible escape route. The front door handle turned. I'd locked it after Mrs. Cayahat left, turned the deadbolt myself. But now the handle was rotating slowly, testing the mechanism with the patient exploration of someone who had all night to figure out how latches worked. "Jacob." Dad's voice, muffled by the wooden door but unmistakably familiar. "I know you're in there, son. Open up. We need to talk." The door rattled in its frame as whatever was outside applied more pressure to the handle. The deadbolt held, but I could hear wood creaking under strain. "I'm not leaving until you let me in, Jakob. We both know you can't stay in there forever. You need supplies, need to check the generator, need to get firewood for winter. Sooner or later, you'll have to open this door." It was right. I had maybe a week's worth of food, and the generator needed daily maintenance to keep the solar batteries charged. This wasn't a sustainable siege, but as I stood there in Grandpa's living room, listening to something that sounded like my father but moved like a predator, I realized the truth Mrs. Cayahat had been trying to tell me. The rules weren't just about surviving one night or one encounter. They were about learning to live with the constant presence of things that wanted to destroy me. This was my life now. This isolation, this vigilance, this endless game of hide and seek with creatures that wore familiar faces and spoke in voices I loved. Grandpa had done it for 30 years. Somehow, I had to find a way to do it too. The door handle stopped turning. The knocking stopped. Even the scratching sounds from the back porch went silent. In the sudden quiet, I could hear something new. The distant howl of real wolves, somewhere deep in the forest. Wild and ragged and alive in a way the 3 watchers outside my cabin weren't. The real wolves were warning me about something. But what? The real wolves kept howling for 20 minutes, their voices carrying across the valley like an alarm system. I'd heard wolves before during my weeks in the cabin, usually brief exchanges between pack members or territorial calls that lasted a few seconds. This was different. This was sustained, urgent, almost frantic. They were trying to tell me something. I crept to the kitchen window, staying low and peering out toward the forest. The 3 knot wolves that had been guarding my back porch were gone. No sign of them anywhere in the yard or along the tree line. Even the dad figure had vanished from my front yard, leaving only the impression of boot prints in the dirt where it had stood. The sudden absence felt more ominous than the siege itself. When predators retreat without warning, it usually means something bigger is coming. At 9:47 p.m., I saw the first green shimmer in the northern sky. Aurora Borealis. I'd seen the northern lights a few times since moving here, usually faint blue-white curtains that danced across the stars. But this was different, aggressive bands of emerald light that pulsed and writhed like something alive. The green was so intense, it painted the birch grove in sickly hues, turning the white bark the color of old bones. Rule 7. On nights when the aurora is green, burn sage and stay inside until dawn. I found Grandpa's supply of dried sage in the kitchen cupboard, tied in neat bundles with cotton string. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the container, earthy and sharp, like summer thunderstorms. I'd never burned sage before. Wasn't sure of the proper technique, but Mrs. Kahat had made it sound like a matter of life and death. I lit the first bundle with my propane lighter, letting the smoke fill the cabin. The scent was stronger than I'd expected, almost overwhelming, but I kept the bundle burning and carried it from room to room like some kind of aromatic torch. Outside, the green aurora was getting brighter, painting the entire valley in fluorescent light. Through the living room window, I could see the forest clearly now, illuminated by that sick green glow. The birch trees looked wrong, too tall, too thin, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. And between the trees, figures were gathering. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing perfectly still in the green light, arranged in neat rows like soldiers in formation. Too far away to make out individual faces, but close enough to see they were all wearing familiar clothes. Red flannel shirts, hiking boots, Converse sneakers, clothing I recognized from photographs, from memories, from people I'd known and lost. The sage bundle crackled and sparked in my hand, sending up thick clouds of white smoke. I moved from window to window, making sure the smoke reached every corner of the cabin. Whatever ritual I was performing, it felt ancient and necessary, like participating in something that had been done this way for thousands of years. At 10:15, they started moving. Not the random shambling of a crowd, but coordinated movement, like a marching band performing complex formations. The figures flowed between the trees in patterns that made my eyes water to follow, appearing and disappearing in the green shadows. Sometimes they looked human, sometimes they didn't. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Emma's number, her contact photo smiling up at me from the screen. Emma, who lived 3,000 miles away in Florida. Emma, whose voice I'd heard calling from the forest the night before. I let it go to voicemail. The phone buzzed again immediately. Same number, same photo. This time I turned the phone face down on the kitchen table, but I could still hear it vibrating against the wood, insistent, demanding. On the fourth call, I couldn't resist checking the voicemail. Jacob, pick up your phone. Emma's voice tight with panic. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. I'm in the woods behind your cabin, and there are things following me. They look like people I know, but their faces are wrong. Please, Jacob, I need help. I'm scared. The message had been left 30 seconds ago, while I was watching the figures move through the forest, while I was standing in my kitchen, holding a burning bundle of sage, looking at my phone. Emma couldn't be in Alaska. She couldn't be in the woods behind my cabin. But the fear in her voice sounded genuine, raw, and desperate in a way that made my chest ache with protective instincts. The phone rang again. This time I answered, but didn't speak. Jacob. Oh, thank God, you picked up. Emma's voice, breathless and relieved. Listen to me carefully. I'm hiding behind a big birch tree about 50 yards from your back door. There are things out here, shapeshifters or something. They're wearing faces I recognize, but they're not right. Their eyes are wrong. Through the kitchen window, I could see the backyard clearly in the green aurora light. No sign of Emma or anyone else hiding behind the birch trees. "I can see your cabin," the voice continued. "I can see lights on inside. But there's something standing on your front porch, something wearing Dad's clothes. Don't let it in, Jakob. It's not him." I crept to the front window and peered through the curtain. The porch was empty, had been empty for an hour. "Emma," I said quietly into the phone, "where exactly are you right now? What do you see?" "I'm in Florida, Jacob." Her voice changed, becoming flat and emotionless. "I'm in Tampa, asleep in my apartment." "This conversation isn't happening. You're talking to something that borrowed my voice." The line went dead. I dropped the phone like it was radioactive, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the sage bundle too. The Kushtaka weren't just mimicking voices anymore. They were having conversations, adapting in real time, learning from my responses. The green light outside was getting brighter, turning the entire forest into an alien landscape. I could see more figures now, some of them close enough to make out individual features. A woman in Monica's hiking jacket, a man in Grandpa's fishing vest, a child in a yellow raincoat I didn't recognize but somehow found familiar. They were all facing the cabin now, standing in perfect rows, like an audience waiting for a show to begin. At 11:30, they started singing. "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday, dear Jacob, happy birthday to you." Hundreds of voices, harmonizing perfectly, singing in the cadence of every birthday party I'd ever attended. Some of the voices I recognized, family members, friends, co-workers from Spokane. Others were strangers, but they all knew the words, all sang with the same eerie precision. My birthday was in March. It was October now, 7 months off. But they kept singing, repeating the song over and over, like a broken record stuck in an eternal loop. The sage bundle burned down to my fingers, forcing me to light another one. The smoke was so thick now, I could barely see across the cabin, but I kept burning bundle after bundle, following Rule 7 like a lifeline in a storm. The singing continued for an hour. When it finally stopped, the silence was worse than the music had been. In that quiet, I could hear other sounds, footsteps on my roof, scratching at my walls, the soft thud of something being thrown against my windows. But nothing broke through. The cabin held. The sage smoke kept them at bay. Whatever protection Grandpa had built into this place, it was working. At 1 a.m., the aurora began to fade. The sick green light gradually dimmed, returning the forest to normal darkness. One by one, the figures between the trees melted back into shadows, disappearing as if they'd never been there at all. I kept burning sage until dawn, going through almost the entire bundle. When the first rays of sunlight hit the windows, I finally allowed myself to collapse into Grandpa's recliner, exhausted and smoke-stung, but alive. Outside, the forest looked peaceful again, normal. Birds were singing in the birch grove, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of a creek running toward the river. But in the dirt around my cabin, new tracks had appeared overnight. Hundreds of them, forming complex spirals and intersecting circles, like the aftermath of some massive ritual dance performed in the green light of the aurora. I'd survived my second test, but I was starting to understand what Mrs. Keahat meant about the rules being just the beginning. This wasn't about surviving individual encounters with shapeshifters. This was about learning to live as the only human in a valley full of things that wanted to wear my skin and speak with my voice. The real question wasn't whether I could follow the rules. The question was whether I could maintain my sanity long enough to matter. I woke up at noon with smoke still burning in my lungs and the taste of sage coating my throat like ash. The cabin reeked of burned herbs, and every window was fogged with condensation from the night's ritual. Outside, the October sun looked pale and distant, filtered through clouds that threatened the season's first snow. The tracks in my yard had multiplied overnight. What I'd seen at dawn was nothing compared to the full scope of what had happened during the aurora. Hundreds of footprints covered my property in elaborate patterns, spirals, figure eights, interlocking circles that hurt to follow with my eyes. Some tracks I recognized from the previous nights: Blad's work boots, Monica's hiking shoes, Emma's sneakers. But there were others now, dozens of different footprints representing people from across my entire life. My high school girlfriend's combat boots, my college roommate's tennis shoes, even tiny prints that looked like the dinosaur sneakers my nephew had worn to my last Christmas visit in Spokane. They'd cataloged everyone I'd ever cared about, every person whose voice might make me hesitate long enough to open a door or step outside. The Kushtaka were building a database of my vulnerabilities, and they were being thorough about it. I was photographing a particularly complex spiral pattern when Mrs. Kayahat appeared at my driveway, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested she'd expected to find me dead. "You survived the gathering," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would." Green auroras bring out the old power, the kind that doesn't respect modern boundaries. How many were there? It looked like hundreds. More than Henrik ever faced. Climate change isn't just melting the permafrost, it's disrupting the spiritual ecosystem too. The Kushtaka used to follow seasonal patterns, hibernating through the darkest months. Now they're active year-round, and they're sharing information in ways my grandmother never described. She handed me the thermos, and I drank the coffee gratefully. It was strong and bitter, with an herbal undertone I couldn't identify. "Labrador tea," she explained, noting my questioning look. "Good for clearing smoke from your lungs and spirits from your mind. You'll need both today." "Why? What happens today?" Mrs. Kayahat studied the track patterns around my cabin, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "They're preparing for something bigger. These formations, they're not random. They're ritual circles designed to focus energy and intention. The Kushtaka are getting ready to test you in ways Henrik never experienced." "What kind of test?" "I don't know. But look at this." She led me to a section of tracks near my front porch, where several different footprints converged in a tight cluster. "See how they overlap here? That means multiple entities were occupying the same space simultaneously. They're learning to coordinate, to share forms and voices." The thought made my stomach clench. Bad enough dealing with individual shapeshifters wearing familiar faces. The idea of them working together, combining their abilities, was genuinely terrifying. "There's something else," Mrs. Kayahat continued. "Something I should have told you earlier, but I hoped it wouldn't be necessary." "What?" She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small carved object, a piece of bone or antler shaped like a fish, with intricate designs etched into its surface. Tlingit artwork, old and worn smooth by generations of handling. "This is a charm my great-grandmother made." She gave it to Henrik during his first winter, when the Kushtaka nearly drove him to madness. "It won't protect you from them, but it will help you recognize when you're being influenced by their presence." She pressed the carving into my palm. It felt warm, almost alive, and the moment my fingers closed around it, I felt something shift in my perception. The world looked subtly different, sharper somehow, like I'd been wearing dirty glasses for months without realizing it. "The Kushtaka don't just mimic voices and appearances," Mrs. Kahat explained. They can influence thoughts, memories, emotions, make you doubt your own experiences, convince you that following them is the logical choice. This charm will help you resist that influence. How will I know if they're affecting me? The bone will grow cold against your skin. Trust that sensation more than your own thoughts. I slipped the charm into my pocket, where it nestled against my thigh like a second heartbeat. Already I could feel its subtle warmth, a comforting presence that seemed to anchor me to reality. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Last night, one of them called my phone, had a conversation with me, pretended to be my sister. How is that possible? How can they use technology?" Mrs. Kayahat's expression darkened. "They're adapting faster than we anticipated. Traditional shapeshifters were limited to physical mimicry, but these new ones are learning to manipulate electromagnetic fields, radio waves, digital signals. Your phone, your internet, even your generator. They're all potential weapons in the hands of something that understands both ancient magic and modern technology." As if summoned by her words, my phone buzzed with a text message. The display showed my own number as the sender, which should have been technologically impossible. "Stop fighting us, Jakob. You know this can't last forever. Eventually you'll make a mistake, and we'll be waiting." I showed the message to Mrs. Kayahat, who studied it with the calm interest of someone examining a particularly venomous snake. "They're inside your phone now," she said matter-of-factly. "Probably have been for days, listening to your conversations, reading your messages, learning everything they can about your life back in Spokane. I'd recommend turning it off and removing the battery." I powered down the phone and pried out the battery with my multi-tool, but the damage was already done. They'd had access to my digital life for who knew how long. Emails, photos, social media accounts, everything. No wonder they knew so much about the people I'd lost. "Mrs. Kayahat, I have to ask, is there any way out of this? Can I leave? Go back to Spokane? Sell the cabin? Pretend this never happened?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying the spiral patterns in the dirt. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Henrik asked me the same question during his second winter. The Kushtaka had been particularly aggressive that year, and he was ready to pack up and drive back to Seattle. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. Once they've marked you, once they've learned your weaknesses and cataloged your fears, distance doesn't matter. They can find you anywhere, anytime. The only advantage this place has is the protections your grandfather built. The iron in the door frames, the sage, the rules themselves. Out there in the modern world, you'd be completely vulnerable." The weight of that statement settled on me like a physical burden. I wasn't just trapped in this cabin for the night, or the week, or even the winter. I was trapped here permanently, bound to this remote valley by creatures that had turned my love for family and friends into weapons against me. How did Grandpa stand it? 30 years of this. He found purpose in it. Became a guardian, protecting not just himself, but anyone else who might stumble into this valley. The Kushtaka stopped expanding their territory because Henrik was here, following the rules, maintaining the boundaries. Now that responsibility falls to you. A guardian. The word resonated with something deep in my chest. A sense of duty I hadn't felt since leaving my teaching job in Spokane. Maybe this isolation didn't have to be purely about survival. Maybe it could be about something larger. The bone charm grew warm in my pocket, and I felt a sudden surge of clarity. This was my life now, but it didn't have to be a prison sentence. It could be a calling. "Will you teach me?" I asked. Everything Grandpa knew about living here, about maintaining the balance. Mrs. Kayahat smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since we met. I was hoping you'd ask. Henrik would have been proud of you, Jakob. Very proud indeed. As we talked through the afternoon, planning lessons and sharing stories, I noticed the forest around us had grown quiet. No bird songs, no rustling in the underbrush, no sounds of normal woodland life. Even the wind had stilled, leaving the birch grove eerily motionless. Something was coming. Something that required the entire forest to hold its breath and wait. The silence lasted until sunset. No wind through the birches, no creek babbling in the distance, no insects or birds or any of the thousand small sounds that make a forest feel alive. Even Mrs. Keohot seemed affected by it, speaking in whispers as she prepared to leave for the night. "Stay vigilant," she told me before heading back to her truck. When the forest goes this quiet, it usually means the old powers are gathering strength. Tonight might test everything Henrik taught this place. I watched her taillights disappear down the logging road, then checked my watch. 6:43 p.m. Darkness would come early this time of year, and with it, whatever had made the entire valley hold its breath. I spent the remaining daylight checking my preparations. Fresh iron nails in every door frame and window, sage bundles within easy reach, mirrors covered, and Grandpa's rule sheet tucked into my shirt pocket alongside the Tlingit charm. The bone carving pulsed with gentle warmth against my ribs, a steady reminder that I wasn't facing this alone. At 7:17, the first knock came. Not at my front door or back door, but on the roof directly above my head. 3 sharp raps against the metal, like someone standing on the peak and hammering with their fist. I consulted the rules. Nothing about knocking on the roof. This was new territory, a test of my judgment rather than my ability to follow written instructions. The knocking came again, moving across the roof from west to east, following the ridgeline. Then more knocking from different directions, north wall, south wall, even what sounded like someone rapping on the foundation stones beneath the cabin. A percussion symphony played on the bones of my home. None of it was on doors or windows. The rules only mentioned responding to knocks on doors. Everything else I could ignore. At 7:45, the voices started, but not from the forest this time, from inside my walls. "Jakob." Dad's voice, muffled but clear, coming from somewhere behind the kitchen cabinets. "I'm trapped in here, son. Can you help me find a way out?" "Oh God, Jacob, where are we?" Monica's voice from the bathroom, panicked and confused. "I can't see anything. It's so dark in here." "Big brother, I'm scared." Emma, sounding like she was speaking from inside the bedroom closet. "There are things moving around me. Please help." The Kushtaka had found a new strategy. Instead of trying to lure me outside, they were claiming to be trapped inside with me, making me feel responsible for rescuing people who weren't really there. The bone charm grew cold against my skin, confirming what logic already told me. No one was trapped in my walls. These were phantom voices, designed to exploit my protective instincts and make me tear my own sanctuary apart, looking for people who didn't exist. "I know what you are," I said aloud, addressing the voices directly. "You're not my family. You're not trapped, and I'm not opening anything for you." The voices grew more desperate, more convincing. Dad explaining he'd fallen through a hole in the floorboards and couldn't climb out. Monica begging me to break open the bathroom wall because she was suffocating. Emma crying like the 8-year-old she'd been when our parents divorced, lost and confused and needing her big brother to make everything okay. Every instinct screamed at me to help them, to grab an axe and tear into the walls, to find whatever impossible space they were trapped in and lead them to safety. The urge was so strong my hands shook with the effort of staying still. But the charm stayed cold, and I stayed put. At 8:30, they tried a different approach. The voice that came from the walls this time was my own. "Don't listen to me," I heard myself saying from somewhere behind the living room paneling. "I'm not the real Jakob. I'm one of them, wearing his face, living in his cabin. The real Jakob is trapped outside, and I'm keeping him prisoner." That was clever. Psychological warfare designed to make me doubt my own identity, my own perceptions. If I couldn't trust my own voice, how could I trust any of my decisions? But Grandpa had faced something similar, according to Mrs. Carhart. During his 15th winter, the Kushtaka had convinced him that everything he remembered about his life was false, that he was actually one of them who had forgotten his true nature. He'd nearly walked into the forest that night, ready to rejoin what he thought was his real family. "I know who I am," I said to the walls. "I'm Jakob Henrik's grandson, environmental science teacher from Spokane, guardian of this valley. You can't take that from me." The fake Jakob voice laughed. "Are you sure? How do you know those aren't false memories we planted in your mind? How do you know you didn't replace the real Jakob months ago?" For a moment, genuine doubt flickered through my mind. How could I be certain of my own identity? Memory was fallible, easily manipulated. What if I really was a shapeshifter who had forgotten its true nature? Then the bone charm warmed against my skin, and clarity returned. I was human. I was real. I was exactly who I believed myself to be. At 9:15, they played their final card. Mrs. Kayahat's voice, calling from my front porch. "Jacob, open up. Something's wrong with the rules. I need to give you new information. Update the instructions. People are going to die if you don't listen to me." This was the most dangerous deception yet. Mrs. Kayahat was the one person I trusted completely, my guide and teacher in this supernatural landscape. If she was telling me to ignore the rules, to open my door, part of me wanted to believe her. But the real Mrs. Kayahat would never arrive unannounced after dark. She'd never ask me to break the rules for any reason. And she definitely wouldn't be knocking on my door in the middle of the night after warning me to be extra vigilant. "You're not Mrs. Kayahat," I said through the door. "I am Jakob. Ask me anything, test me. I can prove who I am. What's my favorite subject to teach? Environmental science? You specialized in forest ecosystems and climate change adaptation. What did you bring me in your basket yesterday? Dried salmon, preserved berries, salt mixed with iron filings and blessed sage. What's my sister's name? Emma. She lives in Tampa, Florida. The thing outside my door knew everything the real Mrs. Kahat knew, had access to all the same memories and information. But it made one crucial mistake. The real Mrs. Kahat would never have answered that last question. She would have recognized it as a test and refused to participate, knowing that playing along with my suspicions would only make things worse. "Nice try," I told the thing on my porch. But Mrs. Kahat would have told me to stop being paranoid and trust my instincts instead of testing her. The fake Mrs. Kayahat's voice changed, becoming flat and emotionless. "You're learning, Jakob." Henrik would be proud. But this was just practice. Tomorrow night, we'll try something you won't see coming. The presence on my porch retreated, and gradually the voices in my walls faded to whispers, then silence. By midnight, the supernatural assault had ended, leaving me alone with the smell of sage smoke and the steady warmth of the bone charm against my ribs. I'd passed the test. Not just by following the rules, but by adapting to situations the rules didn't cover. By trusting my instincts and the wisdom Mrs. Kayahat had shared with me. I was becoming the guardian this valley needed. Outside, The forest was coming alive again. Birds calling softly in the darkness, wind rustling through leaves, the distant sound of water flowing toward the sea. The natural world was returning, the supernatural pressure lifting like fog, burned away by morning sun. I'd survived my first real trial as guardian of the valley, but something told me the Kushtaka weren't giving up. They were just changing tactics, preparing for a longer war. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow and thick curtains that muffled sound and transformed the birch grove into a maze of white columns. I'd learned to read the forest's moods by then, to distinguish between the natural quiet of snowfall and the unnatural silence that preceded supernatural visits. The Kushtaka adapted to the season just like everything else in Alaska. Their tactics shifted with the weather, voices calling through blizzards when wind would mask their approach, footprints appearing in fresh snow that led to impossible destinations, figures standing motionless among snow-covered trees where they blended into the monochrome landscape. But I'd adapted too. Mrs. Kaya Hott visited twice weekly now, teaching me things Grandpa Henrik had learned through 3 decades of trial and error. How to read track patterns that revealed the shapeshifter's intentions, which herbs grew wild in the valley and could supplement store-bought sage when supplies ran low, the proper way to maintain iron barriers when metal contracted in sub-zero temperatures. Most importantly, she taught me to recognize the difference between supernatural threats and my own isolation-induced paranoia. The bone charm helped, but human judgment remained essential. Some nights, the scratching at my walls really was just tree branches moved by wind. Some voices in the forest actually belonged to real wolves calling to their pack. Learning to distinguish genuine danger from manufactured fear was harder than following any written rule. I'd started keeping the journal, documenting patterns and encounters for whoever might inherit this responsibility after me. The Kushtaka tested different approaches during different phases of the moon, responded to weather changes in predictable ways, and seemed particularly active during the weeks surrounding solstices and equinoxes. They were also learning from me. Each successful defense I mounted became a strategy they'd avoid in future encounters. The game of cat and mouse was evolving on both sides, becoming more sophisticated as winter deepened. But something unexpected had happened during those long, dark months. The fear that initially consumed me had transformed into something else. Respect, caution, even a strange form of professional interest. These entities were ancient, intelligent, and operating according to rules I was only beginning to understand. Fighting them felt less like warfare, and more like participating in an elaborate dance that had been choreographed over centuries. Mrs. Kaya Hott told me Henrik had described a similar evolution in his relationship with the Kushtaka. Terror giving way to wariness, wariness becoming routine, routine eventually settling into a kind of wary coexistence. They would never stop testing me, but I would never stop learning how to pass their tests. The valley had accepted me as its guardian, and I'd accepted the valley as my home. On clear nights, when the aurora painted the sky in blue and silver curtains, I'd stand at my kitchen window and watch the shapeshifters move through the forest. They knew I could see them, knew I was watching their elaborate formations and ritual dances. Sometimes I got the impression they were performing for my benefit, showing me glimpses of their true nature that no human had witnessed before. We were bound together now, the Kushtaka and I. Predator and prey, but also teacher and student, ancient power and modern guardian. The rules Grandpa had written down were just the beginning of a much larger education. My phone stayed permanently powered off, its battery stored in a drawer. The satellite internet remained disconnected. I'd learned to live without constant digital connection, finding peace in the rhythm of sunrise and sunset, the cycle of seasons, the slow accumulation of wisdom that came from paying attention to the natural world. The isolation that once terrified me had become a source of strength. In the silence between supernatural encounters, I could hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in years. I understood why Grandpa had stayed here for 30 winters, why he'd chosen this strange form of exile over the comfortable chaos of modern civilization. Some responsibilities chose you rather than the other way around. Some places claimed you whether you wanted to be claimed or not. The Kushtaka were still out there, still watching, still waiting for me to make a mistake. But I was watching too, learning their patterns, becoming the guardian this valley needed. The dance would continue.